In the late summer of 2011, a man named Cal Merritt stood at the back of a folding chair meeting in the Carroll County Extension Office in Berryville, Arkansas, and listened to a certified energy auditor named Doug Fenn explain, with the patient warmth of someone correcting a child, that the baled fiber sitting on the table in front of him was, in Doug's exact words, a novelty item, not a building material, agricultural waste that belonged in a compost pile, not a wall cavity. Doug said this in front of 40 farmers and 3 newspaper reporters, and he smiled when he said it, the way a man smiles when he is doing someone a favor by telling them the truth early. Cal said 2 words back. Then he drove home. 10 years later, in March of 2021, a purchasing director named Martha Vogt drove 4 hours down from Bentonville to Cal's equipment shed in a company Subaru, held a cut section of feather bat insulation up to the window light, turned it in her hands for a long time without speaking, and wrote a purchase order for 48,000 square feet at 87 cents per square foot. That is the number. $41,760, first order, and she did not negotiate the price. This is the story of the 7 years that came before that meeting, and the 10 that came after, and what a man can build from what a world throws away. Let me tell you where Carroll County sits, because the land matters here. It is the northwest corner of Arkansas, Ozark Plateau country, limestone and cedar and second-growth hardwood rolling into river bottoms where the soil goes deep and dark. Chicken country, for a long time. Tyson country, though this story involves no name that large. A mid-sized poultry processing plant had operated on the east edge of Berryville since 1987, running 3 shifts, processing birds at a rate that generated considerable waste. Most of that waste was managed inside the facility. Some of it was not. Starting around 2004, feathers began appearing along the fence line that separated the plant's east lot from the 42 acres Cal Merritt ran as a cow-calf operation and small grain farm. They came in wind-carried drifts at first, a film of gray-white fiber that coated the wire and settled into the grass. Then they came by the truckload. Not dumped exactly, not in any deliberate way that would constitute a violation, but piled against the outside of the fence in quantities that exceeded anything wind could explain, collected by the plant's yard crew and deposited at the property boundary the way neighbors sometimes deposit things they no longer want to deal with. By 2006, Cal had spoken to the plant manager twice. By 2008, he had spoken to him 4 more times, and once to a county environmental officer who noted the situation and took no action. By 2011, there was an 8-foot windrow of compacted feather fiber running along 160 feet of his east fence, 4 feet wide at the base, crusted on the outside and hollow-smelling and warm to the touch in July. Cal Merritt was 53 years old in 2011, known in Carroll County for 2 things: the quality of his spring calves and the fact that he rarely said more than he needed to. He had bought the 42 acres from his father in 1986 for $62,000, paid it off in 2001, and run the place the way his father and grandfather had taught him, which is to say, without debt and without the kind of expansion that requires debt. He was not a prosperous man by the measures the county extension office used. His equipment was paid for and old. His farmhouse had been built in 1948, and he had not renovated it since 1993. What he had was a paid deed, a working herd of 28 Angus cross cows, and by 2011, a fence line problem that no one in authority seemed inclined to solve. The solution Cal arrived at was not arrived at quickly. He did not wake one morning with a plan. What he did, starting in the summer of 2008, was begin composting the feather windrow in earnest. He had been doing this on a small scale already, turning the fiber into the soil at the margins of his grain ground, watching it break down. What he noticed, watching it break down over 2 growing seasons, was that it did not break down the way straw did. The decomposition was slow and partial. The barbs of the feathers separated from the rachis, the central shaft, but the fiber itself, the barb itself, remained. It was tough stuff. He poked at it. He held it in his hand. He remembered something. Let me tell you about Roy Merritt's ledger, because it is where this story really begins. Roy was Cal's grandfather, who had run this same ground from 1931 until 1974. Roy Merritt was the kind of farmer who wrote things down, not in a journal of feelings, but in a record of costs and observations. A brown cloth-bound ledger Cal had found in a cedar chest in 1989 and read twice through. One entry, dated November 1937, noted that Roy had that autumn restuffed the north bedroom wall cavity. An old balloon frame section of the 1948 house had not yet replaced, with a mixture of cotton batting and chicken feathers stripped from the birds his wife dressed each fall, sewn into ticking bags and pushed between the studs. Roy noted the cost as nothing, because the feathers were already there. He noted the result the following February. The north bedroom, previously the coldest room in the house, had used 12% less firewood than the prior winter and remained above 50 degrees on nights when the temperature outside fell to 8. Roy had written, "Stays warm on feathers," noted it in a column of other small efficiencies, and moved on to the spring seed account. Cal had read this entry in 1989 and filed it in the back of his mind. In 2008, standing at his fence line with a double handful of partly decomposed feather fiber, he took it back out. The mechanism that makes feather fiber a viable insulating material is not complicated once you understand it, but it is not obvious to someone who has only ever thought of feathers as waste. The rachis of a contour feather, the central shaft, is hollow. That hollow is not incidental. A bird carries its own insulating layer in the dead air trapped inside those shafts and between the locked barbules, the tiny hooks that hold adjacent barbs together across the face of each feather. When that structure is disrupted, as it is when feathers are loose and ungroomed, the barbules still hold small volumes of air between them, the way cellulose fibers hold air or the crimped scales of wool hold air. Trapped air is what insulation is. It is what slows the movement of heat from one side of a wall to the other. This is the physics of every insulating material in every wall in every house in the country. The material itself matters less than the air it holds and the structure that keeps that air from moving. Fiberglass does it with glass filaments. Cellulose does it with shredded paper. Wool does it with crimped scales. Feather fiber does it with hollow shafts and interlocked barbules, and it has one additional property that wool does not. Keratin, the protein that feathers are made of, is hydrophobic. It repels water at the fiber level, the way a fresh wool fleece resists a light rain before it is processed and the lanolin is removed. This means that feather insulation, unlike standard fiberglass bats, and unlike some cellulose formulations, does not absorb moisture from the wall cavity and does not lose its R value when the cavity humidity rises. The fiber stays lofted. The air stays trapped. Cal did not know the word hydrophobic in 2008. What he knew was that the feather fiber in his hands felt dry even when rain had fallen on it the day before. He knew it sprang back when he compressed it. He knew it held its shape in a way that wet straw did not and wet newspaper did not. He turned it over in his hands, and he thought about Roy's ledger entry, and he thought about the $82 propane bill on the refrigerator door from the previous January. The north end of the farmhouse going through fuel at a rate the south end did not, and he went inside and found a thermometer and a piece of paper and a pencil. His neighbor, Lester Crane, had by then already started building. Lester was 41 years old in 2011, farming 800 acres of row crops and timber ground 4 miles east on Highway 62, and Lester had decided that the coming market was residential construction. He had spoken to Doug Fenn at the same extension meeting, where Doug dismissed Cal's fiber, and Lester had come away from that conversation with a clear picture of what a properly insulated spec house in northwest Arkansas required. 2 spec houses, planned for 2012, standard fiberglass bats, R19 in the walls, R38 in the ceiling, installed per code by a licensed crew, priced at the time at 19 cents per square foot wholesale. Lester was not a foolish man. He was a careful man who had researched his market and done his arithmetic and followed the advice of a credentialed expert, which is what a person with 800 acres and a bank relationship is supposed to do. Doug Fenn was not a bad man. This matters. He was 44 years old in 2011, certified by the Building Performance Institute as an energy auditor, employed by a regional building products distributor with a long-standing supply agreement with one of the 2 largest fiberglass insulation manufacturers in the country. He had audited hundreds of homes and written energy reports that had genuinely helped hundreds of families reduce their heating bills. When he looked at Cal's baled feather fiber on that table in the extension office, he was applying real knowledge to a real question. And the real knowledge he was applying said that insulation products require fire ratings, moisture testing, and certified R-value data from an accredited laboratory, and that none of these things existed for this material, and that a building inspector in Carroll County would reject it on site. He was correct about all of that. He was also, at the time horizon that mattered, wrong. If you have watched someone dismiss something you have been thinking about for 3 years, you know that the words go in and do their damage regardless of how steady you hold. Cal drove home from that meeting and fed his cows and came inside and ate a plate of food and did not mention the meeting to anyone. He did not mention it to his daughter Nora, who was 17 at the time and doing her homework at the kitchen table. He did not mention it to Bess, his shepherd mix, who was sleeping under the table and twitched one ear when he came in. What he did the following Saturday was take a handsaw out to the east fence line and cut 2 sections of 2x4 from a scrap pile, build a small wooden frame 18 inches by 24, stuff it with compacted feather fiber he had been drying in his equipment shed since August, and nail it to the wall of the equipment shed between 2 thermometers, one on the feather-stuffed side and one on the uninsulated steel panel side. He left it there through January. The difference between the 2 thermometers on the coldest night of that winter, January 17th, 2012, when the outside temperature dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit, was 14 degrees. The feather-stuffed cavity ran 31 degrees on the inside face. The uninsulated steel panel ran 17. He did not tell anyone this either. He wrote it down in the back of Roy's ledger, in the same column Roy had used for firewood costs, because the ledger was the right place for it. The next 4 years were years of iteration. This is the part of the story that does not make a good scene, because what it looked like from outside was a man with a fence line problem and a shed full of drying feathers and no obvious direction. What it was, from inside, was a research project without a budget. Cal's first problem was pathogen load. Raw feathers from a commercial processing operation carry bacterial contamination, and he knew that any material going into a wall cavity had to be clean. He solved this in stages. The first stage was extended composting in wire bin windrows, 6 months minimum, turned monthly, which broke down organic matter and reduced bacterial load significantly. The second stage, which he arrived at in 2014 after 2 winters of testing, was a lime wash treatment. Hydrated lime, the same material used to treat manure, raises the pH of the fiber to a level that kills the remaining surface bacteria and stabilizes the keratin. He mixed it at a ratio of 1 part hydrated lime to 12 parts water by volume, soaked the fiber in the wash for 48 hours, then spread it on wire racks in the shed to dry for 10 to 14 days, depending on humidity. The result was a fiber that was dry, odorless, biologically stable, and white-gray in color. His second problem was cohesion. Loose fiber blows around and settles unevenly in a wall cavity. He solved this in 2015 by sourcing recycled cotton scrim from a textile remnant operation in Gentry, 40 minutes west, and learning to card the feather fiber by hand into bats using a pair of wool carder paddles ordered from a fiber art supplier online. The bats held their shape. They could be cut with shears and fit between studs at 16 or 24-inch spacing without falling apart. He was making about 40 bats a week by the end of 2016, enough to insulate a single room per month at residential scale. He had insulated the north end of his farmhouse over 3 winters, working a section at a time, pulling the original horsehair plaster from the interior face of the north wall, stapling building paper, pressing bats between the studs, and tacking new pine boards back over them. He did not hire anyone. He worked on weekend mornings before the cows needed attention. Nora, home from school at Christmas in 2015, had helped him do the north bedroom over a long December weekend, the 2 of them working by lamplight in the cold room, Cal passing bats, and Nora pressing them into the stud bays and smoothing the craft paper, facing flat before she tacked the boards. They did not talk much. When they finished, she pressed her palm flat against the new wall surface and held it there for a long moment, the way you test a stove to see if it is still warm. She said, "It holds the heat in from the room." Cal said, "That's what it's doing, yes." She said, "How much are you saving?" He got the propane invoices from the drawer, and they went through them at the kitchen table. The north section of the farmhouse, heated by the same propane furnace that ran the whole house, had drawn proportionally less fuel each winter since the insulation work began. The north bedroom alone, which in 2012 had required the thermostat to run at 68 degrees to hold 55 in the room, now held 62 at the same thermostat setting. He had insulated the equipment shed the previous winter. His propane bill in the farmhouse's north section dropped from $82 per month in winter to $51. He had not applied for any certification. He had no brand name. He had told 3 people what he was doing. His neighbor, Webb Couch, who ran a small homestead 2 miles south and was interested in everything, and 2 men at a hay auction who had asked about the material in the back of his truck and received a brief, honest answer. He was not building a business. He was solving a problem. If you have ever watched a slow thing gathering without knowing it was gathering, you understand the next part. And if you have ever been dismissed in public by someone who was sincere and confident and ultimately wrong, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments below, because this kind of story seems to find the people who need it. Cal was not marketing anything. He was not seeking validation. He was documenting, the way Roy had documented, in the back of a ledger, what worked and what the numbers said. Nora Merritt came home in May of 2020 26 years old, a degree in environmental science from the University of Arkansas, and a year of work for a Little Rock environmental consulting firm behind her. She came home because the consulting work had dried up and because her father's operation needed help and because she was, in her own framing, taking stock. She had heard about the Feather Project in fragments over the years, in phone calls that went no longer than 10 minutes because her father did not make long phone calls. What she saw when she walked into the equipment shed was 6 years of accumulated process: the lime wash bins, the drying racks, the Carter paddles, the bundled bats wrapped in brown craft paper and labeled in her father's handwriting with dimensions and R-value estimates. She also saw a material that had no third-party testing, no fire certification, no moisture testing, and no commercial pathway. She said, "Dad, you can't sell this without an ICCES report. You can't even give it away legally if someone's putting it in a permitted structure." Cal said, "I know." She said, "So why are you still doing it?" He reached past her and took one of the bats off the shelf and handed it to her. She turned it in her hands the way Martha Vogt would turn it a year later, though Nora's expression was less open and more cautious. She squeezed it. It compressed and then rose back. She held it to her nose. Nothing. She held it to the window. The afternoon light came through the equipment shed's dirty glass, and she could see the hollow shafts of the rachises in the fiber, the interlocked barbules, the structure that held air the way a wall holds people. She said, "What is the R value, actually?" He said, "Best test I could do at home, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 per inch." She said, "Fiberglass bats are 3.2 to 3.9 per inch." He said, "I know." That was the conversation. Nora went inside and made dinner. Bess came and sat on her feet. Cal came in an hour later, and they ate without talking much. And then Nora asked to see Roy's ledger, and Cal got it from the shelf above the kitchen table and set it in front of her. Open to November 1937. She read the entry. She read the one next to it, which was a note on the cost of oats. She read several more. She closed the ledger and left it on the table and went to bed, and in the morning she drove to Berryville and came back with a notebook and a laptop and began making a list of what certification for a bio-based insulation product would require. The spring of 2021 came early and hard. By February, the supply chain disruptions that had been building through the prior 18 months were making themselves felt in building materials in northwest Arkansas in ways that were impossible to ignore. Lumber had already peaked and begun to correct, but the correction brought no comfort to the people who had locked in contracts at the peak. Fiberglass insulation was a different story. The float lines that produce glass fiber operate at very high energy cost, running silica sand and recycled glass at temperatures above 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the energy cost component of wholesale fiberglass bat pricing began moving in January 2021 and did not stop. The feedstock prices that underpinned the manufacturers' supply agreements were also moving, and the agreements themselves were being renegotiated under terms that favored the manufacturer at every point. By March, the wholesale price per square foot for standard R19 fiberglass bats in Doug Fenn's distributorship had risen from 19 cents to 28 cents. By April, it was 31 cents. The margin that had made fiberglass the obvious recommendation for residential insulation, the margin that came from high volume and low per unit cost, was compressing in ways that Doug's spreadsheet could not outrun. He had 17 accounts across 4 counties who were mid-project, locked into bids that priced insulation at the old rates, looking at a materials cost that had risen 30 to 40% in 10 weeks with no sign of stabilizing. Lester Crane's 2 spec houses had been completed in late 2020. Lester had built them carefully and correctly, R19 walls, R38 ceiling, permitted and inspected and certified, code compliant in every detail, and had listed them in January 2021 at $212,000 each. The market had moved under him. Buyers were coming to Northwest Arkansas from larger cities with different habits, asking questions about energy efficiency that had not been standard 2 years earlier. A home energy rater hired by a buyer's agent in April 2021 put Lester's first spec house at a HERS index of 67. A new construction home in Northwest Arkansas, built to current best practices, was coming in at 45 or below. A HERS score of 67 was legal and adequate, and in the new buyer's framing, not particularly good. The buyer walked. A second buyer came in May and asked for a price adjustment that would account for the projected higher utility costs over a 10-year ownership horizon. The adjustment she wanted was $9,000. Lester's original insulation budget had been $22,000 for both houses combined. The actual materials cost, after the spring price increase, had run to $31,400. He had absorbed the overage. He could not absorb a $9,000 price concession on top of it and stay in the black. The second buyer walked too. By May 2021, Lester had one house under a contingent contract at a reduced price and one still sitting. He was not ruined. He was a man who had done the right thing by every conventional measure and found himself looking at a number that did not add up in a market where the conventional measure had shifted while he was building. Doug Fenn called Cal Merritt in March of 2021. This was not a call anyone in the Extension office or the building products community would have predicted. But Doug Fenn was, as this story has insisted on saying, a sincere man, and sincere men update when the ground shifts. He had heard about Nora's certification work from a contact at the Arkansas Energy Office who had seen a preliminary NFPA 285 fire test summary that Nora had arranged through a testing lab in Wichita at a cost of $8,000 that she had spent 3 months saving for out of her consulting income. The summary showed that a feather bat assembly in a standard wood frame wall had passed the fire propagation test. It was not a full certification. It was a data point. But Doug had been in the building products industry long enough to know that a passing NFPA 285 on a novel material was not nothing. He called Cal on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "I've been looking at what your daughter is doing." Cal said, "Okay." Doug said, "I was not encouraging back in 2011. I want to say that straight." Cal said, "You were straight with me then. I don't hold that." There was a silence on the line. Doug said, "The market for bio-based materials is real now. It wasn't real then, not the way it is now." Cal said, "I know." Doug asked if he could come out to the farm. Cal said he was welcome. Doug drove out to the Carroll County farm on the last Thursday of March 2021, a cool, clear morning with the pasture still winter brown and the cedar trees dark along the east fence line. Bess came to his car door when he parked and stood looking at him without alarm, which was her manner with strangers she had decided were acceptable. Cal came out of the equipment shed and walked over, and they shook hands in the yard without much ceremony. Doug had a leather portfolio under his arm, which he had brought and then left in the car, because when he got out and looked at the farm, he understood that the leather portfolio was the wrong register for this visit. He walked the equipment shed with Cal and Nora for 40 minutes. He handled a bat. He pressed it in both hands and felt the rise back, the slow, elastic recovery of the fiber. He held it to his nose and found nothing. He read through Nora's certification file, which by then ran to 80 pages of test data, USDA biopreferred program application documentation, and a preliminary R-value report from the Wichita lab that put featherbat at 3.6 per inch under steady-state conditions. He did not rush through the pages. He stood at the workbench with the binder open and read the fire test summary with the same careful attention he gave to manufacturer data sheets, because this was a man who read what was in front of him. He sat down on a wooden chair in the shed and looked at the shelf of wrapped bats for a while without speaking. Then he said, "What's your cost of goods per square foot?" Nora said, 33 cents, fully processed and batted at current production volume. Doug said, "And what volume can you run?" Nora said, 50,000 square feet a year with the current setup, more with a carding machine. Doug was quiet again. He looked at the cost of R19 fiberglass bat on his phone. 31 cents wholesale, that morning, and climbing. He set the phone face down on his knee. He said, "I owe you an apology for 2011. Cal said, "You were doing your job right." Doug said, "I was. But I was measuring what I knew how to measure." Outside, a late March wind moved through the cedar along the east fence, and Bess shifted at the shed door and then settled again. Doug looked at Cal for a moment, and then he asked if he could give Nora's contact information to a purchasing director he knew at a building supply cooperative out of Bentonville. Cal looked at Nora. Nora said yes. Martha Vogt arrived in her company Subaru on the third Tuesday of April, 2021, referred by Doug through that contact at the Arkansas Green Building Council. She was 49 years old, purchasing director for a regional building supply cooperative that serviced 47 independent lumber yards and green building suppliers across a four-state area. She had reviewed Nora's certification file before she drove down and had made 2 phone calls, one to the Wichita testing lab and one to a building scientist at the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension to ask about the fire test result and the R-value methodology. Both conversations had been brief and affirmative. She pulled into Cal's yard in the early afternoon and got out of the car and looked around for a moment without speaking, taking in the equipment shed and the farmhouse and the fence line to the east and the cedar trees along it. Bess came and sniffed her hand and then went back to the shed doorway. She walked the equipment shed without much comment, the way people who know what they are looking for walk through a space, not performing curiosity, just looking. She took a bat off the shelf and held it to the window. She turned it. She compressed it and watched it rise back. She held it for a long time, maybe 2 minutes, without speaking. The afternoon light came through the shed's east window, the window that faced the fence line, and it came across the bat in her hands and caught the hollow shafts in the fiber, and for a moment the whole surface seemed to glow slightly, gold and pale, the way dried grass looks in late October light. Then she said, "What does your fire test summary show for smoke development?" Nora said, "Smoke development index of 22 in the standard assembly." Martha said, "Fiberglass is 0, but wood fiber and cotton bats run 40 to 60 on the same test." Nora said, "Yes." Martha said, 22 is marketable. It's not 0, but it's marketable to the green building segment that doesn't want fiberglass." She set the bat down on the workbench and stood looking at the shelf of wrapped bundles, 60 or so of them representing 4 months of production, each labeled in Cal's handwriting with dimensions and the R value from Nora's test data. She said, "USDA bio-preferred certification, is that in process?" Nora said, "Application submitted in January. We're expecting approval in the next 90 days. Martha took out her phone and made a note. She said, "I'd want full ICCES certifications before we put you in the catalog." but I can write you a provisional purchase order contingent on that approval. My buyers are dealing with fiberglass price increases they can't pass on. Bio-based, with a passing fire test and a competitive R value, is a real conversation right now. She looked at Cal directly for the first time since she had walked in. She said, "How long have you been working on this material?" Cal said, "Since about 2008. She held his gaze for a moment. She said, "And the feathers come from?" He pointed east. She looked in that direction, at the fence line visible through the shed's east door. The cedar posts, the galvanized wire, the line where his ground ended and the poultry plant's lot began. She nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have understood something that does not need to be said aloud. She wrote the purchase order that afternoon at the kitchen table, Nora and Cal sitting across from her, Bess under the table with her chin on Cal's boot. The kitchen was quiet. The afternoon light had moved to the west windows and lay across the table, in a long, pale bar, and caught the edge of Roy's ledger on the shelf above. Martha's pen moved across the form in the unhurried way of someone who has written enough purchase orders that the form no longer requires thought. The number she wrote was 87 cents per square foot, provisional, contingent on bio-preferred approval, and delivery of an ICCES application and receipt within 90 days. 48,000 square feet. $41,760. She pushed it across the table. Cal looked at the number for a long time. The kitchen was still. Outside, a car passed on the county road, and its sound came and went. Bess did not move. Cal said nothing. Nora looked at the number and then looked out the window at the cedar line and the fence and the east lot of the plant beyond it. The number sat on the table between them. It was 4.6 times the farm gate value of anything else on Cal's land. It was more than his calf sales in any year since 2014. It was, in the plain language of arithmetic, the verdict that the ledger and the thermometer and 12 years of lime wash and carding had been building toward. There was nothing to say that the number had not already said. Doug Fenn's distributorship was 3 weeks into a shortage of standard R19 fiberglass bats when the purchase order was written. He had already begun reaching out to bio-based material suppliers in the southeast. He would contact Cal again in June, this time about whether Cal could handle a second purchase order through Doug's own distribution channels. By that time, Nora had sourced a used commercial carding machine from a wool processor in Nebraska, refurbished it over the course of 8 weeks, and doubled the operation's monthly output. The first bio-preferred approval arrived in July. The ICCES application was submitted in September. The full certification came through in the spring of 2022, 27 months after Nora had come home from Little Rock. Lester Crane sold his second spec house in June 2021 at a price reduction of $8,000 below his list, on a contingency that included a follow-up energy audit. He came by Cal's farm in August of that year, on a Sunday, and walked the equipment shed without saying much. He was not looking for an apology or an explanation. He was looking at the carder, at the lime wash bins, at the production line that his neighbor had built over 12 years while Lester had been building spec houses. He picked up a bat and held it for a while. He said, "What does it cost to get set up?" Nora handed him a 1-page summary she had printed for exactly this conversation. Lester read it. He nodded. He came back in October with his own supply of raw feather fiber, which he had negotiated directly with the plant manager on the east side of Berryville, and spent 2 Saturdays learning the lime wash process from Cal. By the following spring, Lester was producing feather bats under a licensing arrangement with Featherbat LLC, the entity Nora had incorporated the previous December, at a royalty of 4 cents per square foot. He sold his first batch of 6,200 square feet through Doug Fenn's distributorship in April 2022, and the price held at 87 cents. Web Couch came in November 2021, then 2 men who had heard about the operation at a hay auction, then a homesteader from Boone County who had read about the bio-preferred certification in a cooperative extension newsletter. By the spring of 2023, 4 independent producers in 3 counties were licensed under Featherbat LLC's process documentation, each processing feather fiber from poultry operations within 40 miles, each selling through Doug Fenn's distribution channels or directly to green building suppliers, each paying the 4-cent royalty that funded ongoing certification maintenance and the testing costs that kept the product in compliance. Cal's own operation ran at roughly 60,000 square feet per year, the limit of what his equipment could handle, without investing in a second carding machine he chose not to buy. His annual net from the insulation operation in 2022 was $31,400, which was more than his calf sales in the same year. He used $16,000 of it to pay down a small equipment loan, put $12,000 into a reserve account for the farm, and spent $3,000 on a new set of corrugated tin panels for the north side of the equipment shed. He did not move to a larger property. He did not take on investors. Nora had fielded 2 calls from a natural products venture firm in Bentonville and declined both, a decision that required no discussion between them. The feathers came from the plant on the other side of the east fence. The east fence was still there. The plant manager, a different man from the one Cal had argued with in 2008, had signed a materials agreement in 2022 that gave Cal's operation first call on all raw feather waste from the facility at a nominal handling fee of $2 per hundredweight. It was not a large sum. To the plant, it was a disposal cost avoided. To Cal, it was something else entirely. Roy's ledger sat on a shelf above the kitchen table, where it had always sat, and Nora had, the previous winter, typed its full contents into a document file she kept on her laptop and backed up to a drive on the shelf beside it. The original ledger remained where it was. The November 1937 entry remained what it was, a careful man's note about what he had tried and what it had cost and what it had done, filed in the same column as firewood and oats and everything else that kept a family on a piece of ground through a hard winter. Cal had added his own entries to the back pages in pencil, in the same terse accounting style Roy had used. Dates, temperatures, square footages, dollar amounts, the names of the people he had taught. The last entry he had made, in January 2023, read, Lester's first full year, 14,200 square feet. Webb's first year, 9,600 square feet. Royalty received 12 months, $953, everything on track. What the system saw for 7 years was a problem, a waste product at a fence line, a nuisance, a cost. What a man who paid attention saw was a material with hollow shafts and interlocked barbules, and a protein that repelled water and held its shape under compression, a material his grandfather had used when there was nothing else and the north bedroom needed to stay above freezing. The system did not see the hollow shaft. It measured what it knew how to measure, a liability, a code violation waiting to happen, an agricultural curiosity that a well-meaning auditor with a clipboard could dismiss in 2 sentences and a smile. There are 2 kinds of knowing. One kind is wide and fast and confident, built on handbooks and supply agreements and the accumulated data of what has worked at scale in every county in the country. It is real knowledge. It is genuinely useful. It is also, at the particular time horizon that matters, the kind that breaks when the supply chain breaks and the price per square foot moves 12 cents in 6 weeks, and the buyers come wanting a number the handbook did not prepare you for. The other kind is narrow and slow and patient, built on 7 years of watching a material decompose at a fence line and asking what it could become on a great-grandfather's penciled note about a warm north bedroom in 1937, on a thermometer nailed to a shed wall in January, and read again in February, and written down in the back of the same ledger. It is not romantic. It is not nostalgia. It is the knowledge that comes from paying attention to one particular thing in one particular place until you understand it well enough to make it do something a handbook would not have predicted. What is rigid breaks. What is adaptive. What belongs to the ground it came from. What was dismissed and documented and tested and handed forward endures. Cal sat at the kitchen table on a January evening in 2023, Roy's ledger open in front of him, Bess at his feet. The pale winter light came through the kitchen window and crossed the table, and caught the brown cloth cover of the ledger the way it always had. Outside, the feathers were still coming. They always came. He picked up his pencil and made the next entry.